Hello and welcome to BYJU'S Exam Prep. Welcome to another session in our knowledge series where we shall be talking about coastal plains of India. Now, India is that part of the subcontinent where we have more than 7,500 kilometers of coastal landscape. To the south of Tropic of Cancer, right up till almost around 8° north latitude, Indian coastline is spread across both eastern and western part of the peninsula. Along with that, we also have large amount of coastline across the island territories of Lakshadweep as well as Andaman and Nicobar Islands. But when we talk about the coastal plain area, the coastal plains generally extend up till the eastern and the western part of our maritime frontier in the peninsular part of the country. In this session, we shall be taking a look at both the western as well as the eastern coastline of India. We shall try to understand salient features regarding these coastal plains, and we shall also try to understand how these features are reflective of their very formation. So without further ado, let us begin and let us initiate our discussion regarding the coastal plain. Now, when we talk about the coastal plain area, so along the western as well as the eastern part of the country, you'll find that the coastal plains, they extend from the states of Gujarat, Maharashtra, Goa, Karnataka and Kerala along the western part. Whereas along the eastern border, we have our coastal plains extending from the region of Tamil Nadu, Andhra Pradesh, Odisha as well as West Bengal. Now, prima facie, if you take a look at this map, you get to understand few of the distinct features that we generally do not end up noticing. One of the generic features that you will observe is basically the extent of the continental shelf area. Now, the continental shelf area is significantly wider along the western coastline as compared to the eastern coastline that we experience. So this is one of the first observations, and this also has got great ramifications and great implications. So when we talk about continental shelf, so continental shelf, it is wider along western coastline. Now, when we talk about the western coastline, there we know that we have an ever enthralling, competitive and a continuous stretch of western ghats, an escarpment which continues all the way from Gujarat right up till Kerala. Now, these western ghats, between them and the Arabian Sea, we have a very narrow stretch of the plain area that we refer to as the western coastal plain. Now, we know that we have a wider continental shelf area in the region of the western coastline. We also know that we have western ghats very close to the coastline across the region of the western part. So, not only is the coastal plain significantly narrow, but this coastal plain also has got certain unique features. For example, if we take a look at the physiographic impact or the physiographic appearance of the coastal plain for various purposes can be broadly divided into various regional spaces. You have the Kutch and the Kathiawar coastline across Gujarat. Then we have the Konkan coastline across Maharashtra and the region of Goa. Now, this Konkan coastline is where the western coast becomes its narrowest. At this point, it is at its narrowest. That means there is a very little amount of space which is left between the western ghats and the region of the Arabian Sea. Again, it slightly broadens a bit in between Goa and Karnataka, that is referred to as the Kanara coast, and then eventually it becomes broader again in the region of the Malabar coast or the Kerala coastline. So, the western coastline indicates a kind of a physiography where it is broader at the top, narrower in the middle, and again broader at the bottom. Now, why is it that western coastline is so very narrow overall? When you compare it to the eastern coastline of India, western coastline is significantly narrower. And that is because we know that the western coastline is a submergent coast. That means Significant part of the coastline has submerged underwater during the last phase of collision that happened between Indian plate and the Eurasian landmass. Now, due to that collision, we observed that a large portion of the landmass that not only developed a kind of a fault line, but it also submerged underneath. Now, that provides for a kind of a unique feature. While the continental shelf is significantly broader, but that also indicates that closer to the coastline, you will have a kind of a feature which is very similar to somewhat like this, where let's say we have this as the water body and we have part of the submergent coastline at a deeper depth. Now, this is the coastal plain. This is the part of the submergent coast. So, what that eventually means is basically right next to the coastline, you have water which is significantly deeper, and that depth in water allows for certain unique abilities and unique features, such as the western coastline becomes very, very ideal to host and to become a natural port or harbor. Because in order to have a natural port or harbor, what is the general requirement is the fact that water should be deeper, very close to the coastline. That allows larger vessels to park right next to the coastal landscape. So in the western part of Indian coastline, you will observe that because there is a submergent coast, water is significantly deeper, very close to the coastline, and that allows it to host larger vessels, larger ships, and it makes for a very good natural port. Now, other features that you will observe across the western coastline is that you have a general submergence which is observed, which has been observed, and this general submergent coastline indicates wider shelf area. Now, shelf area is generally considered to be one of the most productive landscapes in oceanic water body. Now, in that shelf area, always the amount of biodiversity will be very significant, because in the shelf area, not only do you have the availability of sunshine which allows significant amount of producer community to thrive, but also you have lot of fossil fuel deposits. That is why along the western coastline, typically of the coastal landscape around the Kutch and the Kathiawar coastline, we find fossil fuel deposits. That also provides for one of the natural offshore oil extraction platforms that we have off the coast of Maharashtra, that is in the place of Bombay High. Now, it is ideal for natural ports and harbors. Why? Because water is deeper, very close to the coastline. Now, what does that mean? If the water is deeper and the depth is significant, how does that help an area become a natural coastline? So basically, very close to coastline. So how that helps is, it allows for larger vessels and heavier ships to come closer to the coastline. Allows for larger ships and vessels to come very close to the coastline. Now, this is one of the important attributes which is required for an area to be developed as a port area or a port city. Now, another feature along the western coastline is that here you don't observe a significant deltaic formation. Now, there are a couple of reasons why we experience this. One of the main reasons why we don't experience delta formation is, first of all, majority of the rivers that you observe in the peninsular part of the country, they have a general direction of flow from west to east, because the slope of the peninsular plateau in itself is from the region of western Ghats to the eastern Ghats. So the general slope of land is from west to east. So naturally, majority of the rivers, they end up flowing from the direction of west to east. Now, since you have very less number of rivers flowing actually into the Arabian Sea, so obviously you don't have much scope for the formation of deltas. Amongst the rivers that you observe flowing across to the Arabian Sea, you have amongst the major ones Narmada and Tapi. You also have smaller rivers such as Zuari or Mandavi in the region of Goa. You have Bharatpuya, etc. in the region of Kerala, but they are very, very small rivers. Now, Narmada and Tapi, if you will observe, both of them, they end up flowing through the region of a rift valley. Now, the rift valley, it exists in between Vindhyas and Satpuras. So, because both of these rivers already flow through a kind of a depressed area, when we talk about a rift valley, it indicates a kind of a topography somewhat like this. Now, if a river is flowing here, so automatically the river does not carry out significant amount of vertical erosion. Why? Because the region is already at a depressed level. So that is why vertical erosion is very less. Amount of vertical erosion is significantly lesser. And that is why you don't have significant deltaic formation which is observed. Instead of deltas, along the western coastline, we do observe formation of estuaries. Now, what are these estuaries? Estuaries are basically those areas where the river meets the sea, but then here the sea water also comes slightly inwards. So if you consider a coastal landscape somewhat like this, so if the river is moving near the sea, let's suppose this is the sea and here you have the river. So some part of the saline water and the sea water also enters slightly inland. So this area becomes one of those zones where saline water mixes with the fresh water being brought by the river. And automatically these regions become significantly productive when it comes to biodiversity. Because here we end up finding species not only adaptable to freshwater ecosystem, but we also end up finding species which are very regular in the marine or the saline water ecosystem. So these areas are significantly rich fishing grounds that we observe, and pisciculture and aquaculture can be carried out with a quite significant amount of profitability. In the region of Goa, you observe a kind of a similar phenomena of that estuarine formation that is utilized by the local farmers in what we refer to as the Khazan ecosystem. And thereby, in that region, water through the help of various different channels and valves is allowed to come inland and thereby carry out irrigation in the areas across the various fields in the region around Goa, at the same time allowing the farmers to carry out pisciculture and aquaculture by catching prawns, fishes, shrimps, etc. Now, in the region of the Malabar coastline, some part of the sea water that enters inland and that leads to formation of backwaters. Now these backwaters, they are saline in their nature. And being saline in nature, they also have a unique sense of ecosystem that they can carry with themselves. These backwaters are also famous for hosting various different types of boat races. Now, when we take a look at the eastern coastal plains of India, the eastern coastal plains, they are much wider. They are much wider as compared to the western coastline. And historically, even if you take a look back at the various different stages of our ancient as well as medieval history, you will come across the scenario where various different empires and kingdoms, they fought for the control across the eastern coastline. Because these wider stretches across the eastern coastline, they are significantly very fertile. And owing to the presence of moisture from the nearby Bay of Bengal region, they are very, very productive when it comes to agricultural crops. In many of these areas, for example, in the region of Odisha and along the coastal plain around Odisha, you have multiple various different varieties of rice being grown in the same year. That is the amount of fertility that these coastal plains have. Now, if you take a look at few of the salient features of the eastern coastline, first of all, it is an emergent coastline. What does that mean? That basically means that unlike the case with the western coastline, here significant part of the coastline has emerged out of water. At one stage, this portion was underwater and it emerged emerged above water. So because of this being an emergent coastline, here we observe that the shelf area is very narrow. The shelf area is very narrow as compared to the western coastline. Now, here significant portion of it lied underwater for a long period of time, for a span of many hundreds of millions of years. That is why along the eastern coastline you also end up finding fossil fuels. And here, more famously so, around the region of Krishna-Godavari basin. Here, we do find significant amount of fossil fuel deposits, both in the form of crude oil as well as natural gas, which is present and which can be found in this area. Now, this is a zone where you have multiple rivers flowing into the Bay of Bengal. Now, most of the major rivers in the peninsular India, be it river Mahanadi in the region of Chhattisgarh and Odisha, be it the river Godavari, which is also referred to as Dakshin Ganga, be it the river Krishna, or be it Kaveri. All these major rivers, they empty themselves into the Bay of Bengal. You also have smaller rivers such as Penar, which also move, but these are the larger rivers that we are talking about. Now, all these rivers, after covering a large landscape over the part of the peninsular plateau, these rivers, they form very fertile deltas. And it is these deltaic regions which turn out to be very, very productive. Overall, if we take a look at the coastline and the landscape across the eastern coastline, broad classification if you carry it out, the northern part of it, including the region of Odisha coastline as well as part of the Andhra coastline, that is referred to as the region of northern Sarkars. Whereas the part of the southern part of Andhra Pradesh and Tamil Nadu coastline, this is referred to as Coromandel coast. Now, the rainfall distribution across these areas, they end up varying. For example, when we talk about the Coromandel coastline does not receive rainfall during the advancing monsoons. That is the time that we are in, the season that we are in. While the entirety of the country receives humongous and copious amount of rainfall, Coromandel coastline does not receive high amount of rainfall. That is because the monsoonal winds, they end up being parallel to the Coromandel coastline. And that is why you don't have any factor which can cause rainfall across the Coromandel coastline. This coastline ends up receiving rainfall at the time of retreat of monsoon. Retreat of monsoon, and during what establishes later on by what we refer to as the northeast monsoon. So that is why the Coromandel coastline will receive rainfall in the months between November to January. Whereas when we talk about the region of the northern Sarkars, this in itself is further subdivided and further subclassified into Utkal coast. Utkal coast is the portion or the regional area which we have along the coastline of Odisha. That is where you have the Utkal coast. Now, this Utkal coast ends up receiving sufficient amount of rainfall even during the advancing monsoon because of the existence of a relief feature in the form of Garjat Hills. Garjat Hills, they are present in the region of Odisha, and they provide a kind of a physiographic relief and an orogenic barrier which can cause rainfall to be spread over the region of the Odisha coastline. That is why Odisha coastline ends up being one of the most productive areas. Most productive. Along with the coastal landscape across West Bengal as well, one of the most productive areas. Okay? Now, both along the eastern and the western coastline, we end up finding a series of mangrove populations. And these mangrove populations are of significant contribution to the coastal landscape. However, the mangrove population and their density is significantly greater in certain pockets of eastern coastline, but you also find them in significant proportion in the region around Goa, Gujarat, Maharashtra, and parts of Karnataka as well. Now, these also significantly contribute to the increasing production and the increasing efficiency of the coastal biodiversity landscape. Now, the eastern coastline, by its sheer location, ends up experiencing huge amount of rainfall or slightly larger amount of rainfall in certain seasons because of frequent cyclonic storms. However, these cyclonic storms end up developing in the region of Bay of Bengal only in certain parts and only in certain seasons of the year. If you have an overall comparison, always the western coastal plains will end up receiving humongous amount of rainfall as compared to the eastern coastline. As you move to the southern part of eastern coastline, specifically in the region around Andhra coast, there the conditions become slightly dry during the parts of the year. Western coastline ends up receiving high amount of rainfall almost for a majority part of the year because of the very close proximity and the continuity of the Western Ghats. The Eastern Ghats, on the other hand, are nowhere close to being as continuous as is the case along the Western Ghats. Now, Western Ghats being a kind of an escarpment close to the Western coastal plain means that basically, let's say, here you have the Western Ghats. So, and here let's say you have the coastal plain. So, the winds, the moisture carrying winds, they are suddenly forced up the slope of the Western Ghats and they end up forming very dense clouds, and these dense clouds end up bringing copious amount of rainfall. And that is why here you have very dense forests which are in existence, and the western coastline also forms a part of a biodiversity hotspot. Of the 4 different biodiversity hotspots which lie in India, western coastline along with the Western Ghats, that forms a part of a biodiversity hotspot. When we talk about the mineral distribution, the Western Ghats, and more particularly so the coastal area and the coastal plains around the region of Goa and southern part of Maharashtra, they are also found to be particularly rich in iron ore deposits, due to which significant amount of mining activities have been carried on. So this basically helps us understand the varying features when we talk about the coastal landscape of India. Now, UPSC has been asking questions from this part time and time again, both in the prelims as well as in the mains examination. UPSC ends up picking up few of these characteristics, such as why there is no deltaic formation in the region of western coastline, why there is more deltaic formation along the eastern coastline, or UPSC can also end up asking you about the rainfall distribution and variability which is experienced across both the coastal landscapes. So always you have to look into these aspects while preparing for the examination, and that would put you in a good stead for the mains as well as the prelims part of exam. So that is where we conclude the session, and now we take up few of the questions. One question by Ashutosh. Is it due to recent collision of Indian landmass to Eurasia that India don't have large amount of fossil fuel deposits? No, here the part of collision does not come into play. When we talk about fossil fuel deposits, here we have to understand we have various different types of fossil fuels. If you are talking about crude oil and natural gas deposits, they are basically going to be found in those areas which have remained underwater in geological history. Now we know that a significant portion of Thar Desert has been underwater for a long period of time. So that is why you end up finding fossil fuel deposits in those areas. And the lack of fossil fuels in other areas indicates the lack of underwater placement of these areas in the geological history. However, along the western coastline, particularly in the Kutch and the Kathiawar coast where the fault line exists, there you have the formation of fossil fuels. Similar is the case with the Krishna Godavari basin. Then another question, there are plenty of dams in southern part of India. Do Rift Valley makes dams construction easier? Ideally, it is never advisable to go for dam construction in the region of the Rift Valleys because it is expected to put further strain on these faults, because whenever you have Rift Valleys, you have the existence of fault lines. And these fault lines, what happens when you construct a dam over that is, the water from the dam or water from the reservoir, this ends up lubricating the fault lines. It lubricates the fault lines. And as a result of that, you have seismicity, which is observed. So that is why it is never advisable to construct dams across the region of fault lines. Then, though Arabian Sea is larger in size as compared to Bay of Bengal, why do we find frequent storms in Bay of Bengal? Recently, we have found an increase in number of storms in the Arabian Sea. So, the question in itself partly answers the query. Basically, you are talking about the fact that Arabian Sea is significantly larger. Bay of Bengal being slightly smaller in size ensures that Bay of Bengal ends up heating quite significantly at a faster rate. And for the formation of storms, you do require the temperature of the water body to increase to more than 27 degrees Celsius, and that is when a tropical cyclone ends up developing. However, you have other factors such as greater discharge or influx of river water into Bay of Bengal, the existence of normal Walker cycle, as well as the connectivity to the Western Pacific Ocean, which further facilitates greater frequency of these cyclones in the region of Bay of Bengal. Having said that, recently why we have started observing greater amount of cyclones in the Arabian Sea is purely attributed to the rise in sea surface temperature across the globe. Having said that, still if you take a long-term average, Bay of Bengal has been experiencing more cyclonic occurrences. It is only now that Arabian Sea has also been observing once or twice the occurrence of these cyclonic storms. But still, Bay of Bengal naturally is more suitable, so to say, for development of tropical cyclones. Lakshadweep, Western Ghats have been formed as a consequence of ocean and Indian plate collision. No. Western Ghats have been created as a result of the Eurasian and the Indian plate collision. Due to that collision, Indian plate experienced such a significant amount of force, such a significant amount of impact that a large fault line developed across the western coastline, and the land mass to the west of the fault line that simply submerged under water. And that is what builds up the larger continental shelf area, and that is why Western Ghats, they are not considered as a mountain, rather they are considered to be an escarpment. Is the eastern portion of Western Ghats a rain shadow region? Yes. But then you have exceptions there as well. Majorly because the height of the Western Ghats is quite significant. You find that majority of the areas to the east of Western Ghats, they receive lesser amount of rainfall, and that is the reason why the central and eastern part of Maharashtra, as well as the region of Telangana, northern portions of Karnataka, they observe particularly dry conditions, and they end up observing and experiencing frequent occurrences of droughts. Even this year, that area for the initial portion remained significantly dry. Having said that, you have certain exceptions in the region around Nashik, in the region around Pune, in the region around Bangalore. These areas still end up receiving significant chunk of rainfall because of the presence of certain gaps which are found in the region along the Western Ghats, which allows the passage of air, the moisture-laden air coming from the Arabian Sea and thereby causing rainfall. That is why the weather conditions in these areas, be it Nashik, Pune or Bangalore, that is much more moderate and much more pleasant as compared to the other portions to the east of the Western Ghats. So that is where we'll restrict the session for today. Hope that this has added some value to your understanding about the eastern and the western coastal plains. If you like the video, please don't forget to click on the like, share and the subscribe button. Thank you.